Hello everybody and welcome back. My name is Kari and today I am talking about the Alamo. In January I read Alamo All-Stars by Nathan Hale and Sam Houston and the Alamo Avengers by Brian Kilmeade. I read these A, because I was curious, and B, because I didn't really know anything about the Alamo except that it was a loss sometime in the early 1800s. And by early I mean between 1800 and 1850. Now, quick background for those of you who have never heard of the Alamo except for the rallying cry "Remember the Alamo," and don't really know why it seems to be so important to Americans. Caveat there, it is more important to Texans than it is to anybody else in the country. But, like I said, quick background. So, 1776, we were at the Declaration of Independence, break ourselves free from Britain, signed the Treaty of, I believe it was Paris. It was either Paris or Versailles, it's always one of the two. In 1783 that ended the Revolutionary War, got our own independence, had our Constitution and Bill of Rights drafted and ratified in 1789 and 91 respectively. Had a couple of presidents, Washington, Jefferson, Adams, maybe you've heard of them. Slavery wasn't really a thing that we addressed because if we addressed it, it was just going to blow us up sooner. It eventually blew us up anyway, but that comes later. 1812, we fight another war against the British because they keep stealing our soldiers and they haven't left our land yet. We win that and actually get them to leave. And then we expand a little bit. In 1803, to go back, Jefferson, as president, buys the Louisiana Territory from France because France is a little bit in debt, and Napoleon decides that he'll just sell all of this land for, I think it was $5 million, which is a lot of money then and now, but dirt cheap at the time. We have all this territory, which does not include Texas or Florida, because Florida belonged to the Spanish. And then we go a couple years. Meanwhile, the Mexicans are trying to break free from the Spaniards. They eventually do that. And then we get to 1836. By this time, there are several American immigrants who have moved to Texas with permission of the Mexican government. They moved there because there's a lot of land. Texas is huge. Yes, that stereotype is correct. And they wanted to move there. Mexico made a couple of governmental decisions that the immigrants decided they really didn't like, and it became a sore spot for immigrants and the government officials alike. 1836 comes around and the Texians, as they were called, people from the states who had moved into Texas with permission of the Mexican government, decided that they were going to try and change things. And the Mexican government in Texas gets a little bit nervous because when people try to change things, especially people from a country that broke away from its motherland not that long ago, things are probably going to get a little bit dicey. What happens is the Mexican officials decide to take back a cannon from the town of Gonzales. And this is mentioned rather prominently in this book. The cannon was originally given to the town of Gonzales to protect them from the Native Americans there, because when you invade somebody else's land, that also gets really dicey. And the Comanche, specifically the Comanche, I want to say there was Apache there too, but I could be wrong. Either way, the tribes that were already there had a reputation for attacking the settlers because the settlers were taking their land. And so the Mexican government had given Gonzales a cannon a while ago. 1836 comes and they go, well, we don't really want these people in Gonzales who are Texians to have a cannon to help beat us. So they go and they try to take the cannon away. People of Gonzales hear about it and say, ha, no, we're going to keep this cannon because we have to worry about the Indians. And the Mexicans say, well, we only have 5 people, we can't take it from you today, but we're going to come back. So they come back and there's this whole big thing with a flag, and it's called the Battle of Gonzales. I wouldn't consider it a battle. There was maybe 2 shots fired, from my understanding, and I think maybe 1 person got injured. it was not a big deal. But they got to keep their cannon. And that sort of sets off the Texas Revolution. Texas Revolution lasted from 1836 to 1837. Sam Houston, in this book, features prominently in that he starts to help lead the militia / army in the Texas Revolution, and then he ends up being governor of Texas, and that's how we get Houston, Texas. I will say that about this book, it didn't necessarily focus as much on the Revolution and the Alamo specifically as I wanted, because it was focusing more on Houston at the time. But so we go through Gonzales, and then we get all these people together who have decided that they really don't want to be part of Mexico anymore for various reasons, and they decide that they are going to keep their land. They're maybe even going to take it from Mexico, and they form this giant militia, army, whatever you want to call them. They're very riffraff because it's not an official army. They start marching towards San Antonio, which is where the Alamo is. Along the way, they are trying to find places that are defensible to spend the night, and at some point, was it Bowie? Yeah. Bowie is sent out to find a place that the army can stay for the night, and he finds a place called Concepcion. So he has a choice to make. He can either return to the army and they can move out after it's dark, which seems like a really bad idea since they're following a river and, moving in the dark isn't great anyway. Or he can stay there and just go and get the army the next day. He decides to do the latter, but turns out he gets into a little bit of a skirmish with the Mexican army who was approaching from the other direction, from San Antonio. They get into a skirmish, Bowie wins. That seems to be sort of the first big victory, and the Texians are all celebrating, oh my goodness, we beat the Mexican army and it's great, so they keep going on to San Antonio. There's obviously a lot of problems along the way because people desert because they want it to be over in a week and it's not, it's several months, or they're running out of supplies, or they're worried that the Mexican government is going to go and take back the Texians' land that they have left defenseless with just women and children. So a lot of problems and hiccups along the way, but eventually they get to San Antonio, and Ben Milam, who is apparently smart but also an idiot, as they're going through the streets, fighting street by street, he decides to stand in the middle of the street to get a view of the Alamo where the Mexican government had holed up, or the Mexican army, and because he's standing in the middle of the street, he gets shot dead. Unfortunate, but stupid. So they lose him, and they keep moving and keep going on to the Alamo, and eventually the Mexican government leaves because they realize they can't take it or don't want to hold it, it's not worth it, and so the Texians take over the Alamo in San Antonio and stay there. Meanwhile, Sam Houston is off in Tennessee and DC and trying to sort of work his way into getting Texas made a state, should they want that, without pissing off the Mexican government by overtly saying it. Now we also have General Santana in this, who is not portrayed well in American history. Whether or not he's portrayed well in Mexican history, I don't know, because from this book it sounds like he's just a grade A jerk. He doesn't treat his own people well, and he certainly doesn't treat the Texians well. But he's a pretty good general as far as the actual military tactics go. He's the one fighting this. He wasn't thrilled with the people who left the Alamo, and makes them go back and fight again to take the Alamo. So we got General Santa Anna on one side and the rest of them, Bowie, Crockett, Houston on the other side. Houston sends orders because basically the Alamo has been taken and then sort of abandoned, with the exception of about 100 people, 100 defenders and various women, children, vulnerable people left in the fort. Another point of background, the fort is an old mission that was built in 1718 and then eventually just sort of abandoned, and at this point it's being converted by the Alamo defenders into a fort because they took it and then they get orders to abandon it from Houston because the Mexican army is coming back to take it and they don't have the people there. They disregard orders, and this is one of the dumbest things they have ever done. Disregard orders to abandon the Alamo, which is not a particularly defensible place, and especially not when the other side has massive cannons and you have maybe 20. It is also, you have 100 people. They send out the word and they ask for help. They get a couple volunteers, so eventually their numbers for active defenders end up at about 150. I think it's either Bowie or Crockett. To be honest, I get them confused because they're both mountain men and I don't really care enough to distinguish them all that much. But anyway, they're both there. One of them is in bed sick, Bowie. It's definitely Bowie because there's a story about his knife. Bowie is in bed sick during the entire Battle of the Alamo. Nobody can get out. So the women and children are there, just kind of cowering and trying not to die. Bowie is sick in bed and the rest of them are defending. They are trying to not die. And they hold off the Mexicans for a decent while, considering they only have 150 people. They've got really good sharpshooters, they've got better muskets than the Mexican army, and Santa Anna is just getting angry. He is furious that these peons of Texians are holding the Alamo from him. So he eventually just decides to cannon fodder his men and sends them in. They take the Alamo. It doesn't take much because there's a massive gap in one spot where Crockett is, and they have to abandon a lot of their cannon because they're on the outskirts of it, and the mission itself is behind other walls, but the walls aren't that tall. I assume and think they're made of adobe or some version of that, and if they're not, they're definitely made of earth, and they threw up earthworks as a further barrier. They stuck in sharpened pikes in the ground to deter the Mexican army. It works, but only to a point. You have 150 people defending against several thousand. It's not going to go well. Didn't go well for Sparta either. So Mexicans get through, and there are various legends about how people died. He ended up pulling back into the mission, and he was one of the ones, according to legend, he either died on the wall or he was killed after surrendering, as were the rest of the Alamo defenders. The women and children were spared, so that is something anyway, but all of the defenders were killed. The sick man, Jim Bowie, was in his bed and he was slaughtered there. Didn't really have time or energy to try and defend himself. We end up with the victory of the Alamo, where every able man in there has been slaughtered by the Mexican army. This book does not do a good job of differentiating between legends. It presents as truth the fact that Crockett and several men who had held out surrendered and then were killed on Santa Anna's specific orders after having surrendered to a different general, not general officer, who didn't want to kill them because, you know, honor demands it, but Santa Anna just ignored it and had them all killed. So this one presents certain things as truth that are not truth, or that we don't know are truth, and that kind of bugged me. This one, however, did a good job of explaining there are several different legends to how these people got killed. We don't know, but they did all end up dead on Santa Anna's orders, either way. There were several women and children, and all of the women except one were paid, I believe it was 2 bits, and released. One of the women was offered to take her daughter and go to Mexico City with Santa Anna to raise the daughter as a good Mexican gentlewoman, and the woman whose husband had been killed after surrendering, I believe, said, no thank you, and so she was given essentially the story and taken out of the Alamo and released. She did make it back to Houston, and that's how the story was told of what had happened. That poor woman, really and honestly, that's awful. Her kid was less than a year when this happened. But particularly what interests me, eventually, in case you didn't know, eventually the Texians won the revolution after a couple more battles. Santa Anna and Houston ended up coming back to direct the army, militia, whatever you want to call them, of the Texians, and they chased each other around Texas for a while, crossed a couple of rivers, killed a lot of oxen. Eventually they had a face-to-face battle, and Santana tried to run, was caught, recognized by his own troops, and ratted out, at which point Houston said, okay, let's negotiate. They negotiated, Santana lost, surrendered, and was actually then sent to DC as an emissary, an ambassador for Mexico. Just a very interesting turnabout, but here we are. So Texas won, or the Texians won more specifically, and they took the land and decided they didn't want to be a state. Part of that was that, I believe it was Jackson who was president at the time, or whoever came after him, couldn't make Texas a state because it was 1837 or 8, and we had the Missouri Compromise of 1820 something, which said that anything above Missouri will be a free state when it enters, and anything below it will be a slave state if and when it enters, to keep the balance in the Congress between free and slave states. Slavery is getting more and more contentious by the day at this time, and they couldn't risk Texas coming in because by the Missouri Compromise it would have to be a slave state. And that just rubbed some people the wrong way, whether they be in Texas or Vermont. It didn't matter, it caused a lot of problems. So we ended up just not having them in the Union at the time. A couple years later they end up coming into the Union, but Texas was its own country for a while, and that is the reason its flag can fly as high as the United States flag, whereas every other state's flag has to be lower. Fun fact. Students in Texas learn something entirely different, apparently. They learn about the Alamo, they learn that it's a battle, they learn that the Texas Revolution is a thing. But in Colorado, at least, where I grew up and went to school, we are taught Texas is its own country. There's this battle called the Alamo that we lost, and that's where the cry, remember the Alamo, came from. Bowie and Crockett were there, and now we move on to the Mexican-American War in 1846 to 8, and where we got a large chunk of the Southwest and West, which is how we got California as land right before the gold rush. But that's about all we're taught. Apparently in Texas they're taught this is a victory. It's not a victory. I will call it a stalemate if everybody on both sides is killed. That's not a victory for anybody because that is a massive loss of life. It is not a victory in any sense of the word. If everybody on one side dies, but a lot of the other people die, and everybody who dies has surrendered on the one side, so you know the Texians, because they surrendered, and if they didn't surrender they died, and they died anyway. So that's not a victory. They didn't win anything, they lost badly. Through their own stupidity, apparently, because why would you not abandon a fort that you don't have the men to hold? But that is opinion. Either way, Texas students are taught that that is a victory. They are apparently made to take Texas history at least 3 times in their academic career between ages 6 and 18, which is insane. Interesting to read these books and realize how different Texas teaches things. In the States, Texas is technically part of the South, but it's mostly just sort of its own thing, kind of like Russia is part of Asia and Europe, but nobody refers to it as either of those. It's just Europe, Asia, and Russia because it's so massive it could be its own thing. Texas is very similar. The South is Louisiana, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, the Carolinas, the Virginias, Kentucky, Tennessee, and then there's just Texas. But it's very interesting. I have to say, this book was good for a more in-depth reading than this, obviously, because it's at least 100 pages more than this one, and this one is a graphic novel, so it can't put quite as much in it. However, this one presented a lot of legends as absolute truth and did not let you know that they were legends, such as Crockett and however many men were left, I don't think it was very many, maybe 10, surrendering and then being killed on Santana's orders. We don't know that that happened because the woman who survived wasn't there to see it. And it's not something you're really going to talk about afterwards. You're a little bit busy with despoiling the town. I think maybe the Texas victory on the front here refers to the Texas Revolution as a whole, which yes, was a win for Texas at large, but this does have the Alamo on the front, and it says the Alamo Avengers, so it seems to focus a lot more on the Alamo, although in the book itself it didn't. And I think knowing very, very much so how the power of words works and the arrangement of them, this makes it sound like the Alamo was a victory. I do remember reading that he said it was a loss in here, so I like that he at least admits that, but I do think the cover, the title, should be clearer. Talked about Sam Houston a lot, which is good because, you know, book is supposed to be about Sam Houston. I do wish he'd presented a little bit more on the facts themselves than anything else. Whereas this book, I think, did a really good job. It presented the same information, not in quite as much depth, obviously, but I think it did a better job, even, at explaining the Texas Revolution and the Alamo. What I also love about this book is, let me back up. If you don't know what Nathan Hale's series is, or this series specifically, his Hazardous Tales, it starts with Nathan Hale the spy being hanged. And right before he's about to be hanged in the 1770s, I can't remember the exact year, I want to say 78, he is swallowed up by a giant history book and then spat back out on the scaffold. And the executioner and the soldier there go, "What just happened?" And he says, "Well, I was swallowed up by a history book," and then he proceeds to put off his execution, his hanging, by telling them various different stories from all over in history. In this book, Nathan Hale is there, and we also see an ex-Mexican president from about the same time period, 1700s, who is about to be executed, and he pops into the story with his executioner and hangman. So we get to see a different one, same sort of premise, but we get to see that as well. It also starts right in the action, which is not what most of Nathan Hale's books do. So it was just really fun to see something so completely different. And if I can find it, it switches, makes you turn the page, there we go. Makes you turn the book entirely so that you can follow each of these 5 leaders, including Sam Houston over here, through by following their different colored lines and figuring out where they end up. Some of them die, a couple of them make it to prison in Matamoros, which is really not a nice name for a town, but it's very interesting to see how all of that works. This one is also just hilarious because the hangman, who is one of my favorite characters in this series, is very excited to be around other hangmen. Like I said, I think this one did a better job at focusing on the Alamo and giving a really good overview of the Texas Revolution and the fact that, yes, there were a couple of wins. Not all of them, like Gonzales, were important enough to even be remembered, but here we are. The Alamo was an absolute loss, and then it goes into, or at least discusses, the fact that things like Crockett's death were legends. We don't know exactly how he died, we just know that he didn't come out of the Alamo. Whereas, as I've said, this one doesn't do that. So that's these 2 books. I realize that this video is really long, I'm sorry, but if you've stuck around, thank you. Let me know what you thought, or just leave an emoji, whatever you like, down in the comments. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!